So, Josh, I know construction is infamous for being a difficult industry to be profitable in because there's just so many ways to lose money. If there's anything I've gathered over talking to contractors in the last couple years, it's just that you can lose money from anything, from everything that you do. And so I know you've had a lot of experience with that yourself. Tell me a little bit about your experience as a subcontractor and how that kind of led to what you're doing now.
Yeah, so I started by I was with an electrical contractor doing Google data centers. So it was $300 million electrical contracts. We had four of them at the time. So I was working on over $1 billion of work. The cost coding is so important because when you have a 3-year project, you have to make sure that you're on track. And it's not just, okay, I'm 10% done with the duration of the project. It's, am I done with 10% of the scope that I have to do? Right? Am I front end loading my scope? Am I ordering my material where it's on time to get there in 24 months? Because we had 64 generators and they're all over a year lead time. We have to make sure it's all prepped and everything's ready. So there's a lot that goes into it. I transitioned my whole career, to high rises and then Langley Air Force Base, things that are military and hospitals and things like that. And I kind of came to this crossroads of every company does it similar when they're over, I want to say 500 million, they have standard processes. But when I worked for the mom and pop shops that were a little smaller, just putting a couple little things in there would help them with those inefficiencies, like you're saying. So I always wondered, like, what am I good at? I like to do the management stuff. I like to plan. I like to help with that. But I really enjoyed teaching it because it was like when you see somebody have that aha moment of, oh, this makes sense why we did it this way 3 months ago. I've really enjoyed and leaned into, I'm good at efficiency. I might as well help other people. But it all ties back into finances. So being a fractional CFO, maybe I do everything for the COO kind of concepts, like processes and how we actually are doing things and tracking things. But it all ties back to a financial component that I can prove to you what we've done has worked. So
Right, right.
that's ultimately where I'm at.
And you've come up with kind of a framework for helping contractors understand where they're losing money. I think you call it the 5 pillars of profitable subcontracting. Tell me a little bit about those.
Yeah. The first step you always are going to run into is, where do I find the work? Business development kind of concept. You can't build what you can't win, or sorry, you can't build what you don't win, and you can't win what you don't even see coming or what's out there. So it's really about the pipeline. How do we identify our ideal clients? How do we identify what we want to bid, our profit margins? And then you get into estimating the work, which I call winning the work. And that's kind of like a business plan for the next 6 months to 3 years, depending on how long your project is. You want to operate it, or you want to bid it like, how am I going to run my company the next 6 months? What's it actually going to take? Not historical data. What did it take the last 3 years to do this same kind of work? Because you're going to be growing, increases in manpower and
Hmm.
rates and efficiencies as technology comes up. Then what comes up next is pillar number 3, which is performing the work. How do we make sure that everything gets installed contractually right? We follow up on change orders. We don't lose money through all of the little idiosyncrasies of communicating across a project, from project management to field to the client and the owner. And then once you kind of get to those and you master those, you kind of get to this point where you're like, okay, I want to grow. I can take on more, but I'm already struggling to fund what I currently have, right? So pillar number 4 is, if you can't float the job, you can't finish a job. We're going to learn how to fund the project. And that starts with job costing, like you guys promote with your software quite a bit. We track those on monthly cost, like labor cost codes. You track it with labor, material, subcontractors, direct job costs, a couple other things in there too, equipment. We just look for trends. We look to see, am I on track? Am I billing properly? It gives us a data set instead of going off of gut instinct. Everybody has a different gut instinct. I've worked with tons of owners who think that they're making money, and they should be. But when you think about, well, when I bid this job, it had a 50% profit margin, but now it's a year over schedule. It's a 2-month project, but now it's 6 months late. That's where you lose a lot of money. So we try to dial that in. And then when you get that dialed in, you can provide that data to banks, to different funding organizations, and you get better rates with your if your WIP report and your bonding report is accurate. So ultimately, that's what we focus on in the funding the work portion. And then we get to, once you get all of that, now how do we protect it? Because when you get to the end of the job, you always are hit with back charges or some kind of thing. You didn't contractually do these things. You have to turn in this testing report that you didn't think about. So we look at how we protect the work through insurance, through legal, through contract review, everything like that.
Yeah. You mentioned when you're talking about winning the work, we have this concept of using all of your historical data to inform your future estimates. And you mentioned not necessarily basing all of your estimates on historic data, basing it on what you need in the future. Can you unpack that a little bit? Like, tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that.
So a lot of companies I've seen work do square foot numbers to estimate. Like if I have a 32,000 square foot warehouse and I know it's $60 a square foot, I charge that. But that's what it costs you then. Now your labor goes up. Now your material goes up. And you can't just, it all goes up so differently. Like with the tariffs right now, you have aluminum going up at a different rate than steel, which is a different rate than your labor goes up for the cost of inflation. What historical data is good for is looking back and saying, hey, on this 32,000 square foot warehouse, it took us, when we do job costing, we look at your EMT, for example, because I have the electrical background, or underground, right? We had 1,000 hours. It took us 900 hours. So when we estimate this, we know we can save 10% on the labor. Now you can use that to see where can I cut to make sure I'm competitive, but also plug in your new labor rates, right? Because if you did that project 3 years ago and there's 15% increase in labor, like that's going to change. But then if there's a 5% increase in aluminum, but a 50% increase in copper, those are kind of the things. We want to use the data historically to refine what we do, but not make it the Bible of, well, this square foot number's always been true. It was true, but it needs to update.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And then you were talking about funding the work. I watched some of your content before this call, and I was super interested in that portion of it because I know that's a piece that like all contractors get hung up on is I did the work, I'm waiting to get paid, but I've got to go do this next job, and they get caught in the middle. Tell me a little bit about how you work with contractors to refine that part of their process to make sure that they have enough cash in the bank to fund the next job and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and like I said, it kind of all ties back together. It's inevitable. People come to me in the middle of the problem, right? Like I don't have cash flow. I need this by Friday. Like first off, I'm not a bank. I can't even help with that. But we can solve some things. So when you get a new contract, let's look at your schedule of values. Let's plan out how we are going to front load our costs a little bit. We'll try to recognize revenue and profit and maybe a little contingency earlier in the project. So as we go, maybe we're overbilled 6%. That's kind of an average that I like to see. It's a healthy number and it's not too much. Plus, when you have retention held out, that really hurts you too. So a lot of contractors will say, they'll look at their QuickBooks for the day. Where am I at? I've spent 100,000. I'll bill them 100,000 because that's where I am. Didn't pay themselves a dime. They didn't actually spend 100,000 because that was as of that day, not by it's. You're supposed to forecast for the end of the month, and then they don't have any overhead or profit. Plus, they're losing retention. So it's just like, of course, you're always behind when you do it that way, right?
Yeah, totally.
So a couple things that we can do, we look at the schedule of values. How do we fix that immediately? Because that'll fix your month-to-month problems. But then we start to look at, okay, we want to bring in financing. How much does it cost you to finance money? And not every client costs the same. Some GCs that pay 30 days or net 30 will cost you less because of the inflation on that money as you're waiting for it versus ones that pay a net 90 and anywhere in between. And that could be anywhere from 1% to 5 or 6%. If you're doing 6% and your profit was only 5, you're technically paying to do those jobs. So we need to identify that. And then we take that information, go back to our estimating side, and we say, well, if we were going to, maybe we put 6% profit on this, or maybe we account for that, we add that 6%. And I always get pushback like, Josh, nobody's ever going to pay more for these things. But really, people don't care about the low price. They care about knowing that they're going to get the job done on time and you're not going to go bankrupt from the whole thing, right? So, although some industries, like when you look at public works, they are low bid, they have to still make it to the time to the end of the contract. And so you can let people weed themselves out while you stick with what you're pricing and you know it works. The hard part is everybody wants to be about the low bid. They want to be as cheap as possible. But what it costs for you to run your business is different than what it costs somebody else to run the same business because they pay themselves different rates. They decide to buy different vehicles. They shop different insurances. Maybe they have student debt or business debt that they're trying to pay off. So you can get more competitive, but you need to do what really matters for you. If you have a $100,000 loan you've already taken out, but you have to pay it back, to just do what everybody else does is never going to pay it back and you're going to default. So you
Right.
need to plan for that, right?
Right. There's so many variables at play in construction that it's like, to make them all work together, everybody has a different process and a different level of efficiency. And I know you've also talked about finding a niche, not just like I do concrete, but maybe you do like you do a specific job within concrete work,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's because you found a way to be super, super, super efficient at that one thing, which means you can make more money at the end of the day because you've made it as cost efficient and time efficient as possible. So if there's one thing, when you take all of this together, if there's one thing that you would want to leave contractors with, one thing you just want them to know, what would it be?
And there's so many things. The thing I would say is just like, don't just sign your contracts, like read them. Like you make these awesome proposals and people think that, I sent in this proposal, now it's like they locked in this price, we're good. But when they give you the contract, nobody communicates between on the GC side between the PM and the estimator to say, hey, this is what's included and what's not. The PM says, I need, like, per company standard or whatever I want, I need the plumber to include a composite cleanup, one per every 10 hours that they work, 1 hour per every 10 hours, for example. Well, that wasn't in the estimate, and that's not on our proposal, and we excluded that. But he's going to write it in because that's just a standard. He doesn't read that. He just looks at your bottom line number, right? They start going through all of that, and then you get it and you sign it. Well, now you have a $50,000 cost that you didn't account for. You have payment terms that are pay when paid, but you don't even know how long they're going to take to get paid. And if you think about it, if we're supposed to, as a subcontractor, bill on the 20th of the month, the general contractor bills on the 1st or the 30th, kind of like the end of the month, beginning of the month. And then you have 30 days that they have to wait, and then they get to pay you 10 days later. To them, they're paying you pay when paid. But to you, that's really like net 45, 60, right? And when you just sign these things blanketly and blindly, like maybe that is the industry standard. But if you knew that going in, you might have priced it differently than if you just took the contract and signed it, especially with the obvious things to me, like the blanket statements of you owe this kind of composite cleanup, or here's our safety that you have to manage. I've been with some contractors, GCs that are massive, right? Big name people. And their safety alone makes you spend 20% extra labor just from safety meetings and all that crap. And that's, to me, like, you just price those people different, right? That's what it costs for that company to do the work. You know what it's going to cost and take you to do it, to work with them. So give them a different price. That's fine. And if they want a cheaper price, they'll figure it out.
So what do you tell contractors that are navigating payment terms? Like it feels like it is an industry standard that you just you get paid when everybody gets paid and you just got to wait and deal with it. So how do you help contractors navigate that? Because that's obviously a really big challenge.
Yeah, it is. And a lot of times people will complain. Like if you watch the videos like you did, you'll hear what I say about it a lot. It's kind of like what they say is, well, our legal department won't approve that, right? But that person's legal department does what's best for their company, and they're trying to mitigate their risk. At the end of the day, you didn't sign a contract with the owner. You don't know, you're not allowed to go to the owner and ask them for money. You are only allowed to go to the GC, who you don't know if they've billed or not. I've had clients that they billed for January, but the owner or the GC didn't bill the owner until April. And you're sitting here thinking, oh, it's pay when paid, I'll be paid next month. Hey, where is this payment? Oh, yeah, it's we haven't been paid yet. Well, of course you haven't been paid. You didn't even bill it. So like that's super sketchy, right? So what I try to do is make it a little more clear. And things that I've learned to negotiate in is let's do net 45 or pay when paid, whichever is less. So what that does, that puts a timer on there. If I know if net 45, for example, on the 20th, if that's when my bills due, that's like the 5th of the month that I want to be paid in, right? 4th, 5th, somewhere in there, depending on how many days there are. And if I'm not paid by that day, like I'm going to be following up 2 weeks before it, make sure, hey, are we on track? Maybe they did get paid early, because GCs will also hold their money as long as they can. Maybe they were paid 2 weeks ago and they just didn't tell you, and you can't hold them accountable. But when you do the pay when paid or 45 days, whichever is less, it gives you a stopping point, and then you put in legal notices that are like pre-liens, if you will. Hey, if I'm just making sure you guys know that my invoice has been in, I expect to be paid. If this isn't going to happen, I plan on stopping work and I'm going to file a lien. I don't want to do that, but here's like my preface, right? And maybe you just got lost in paperwork. That happens all the time. Companies are so big. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to hold them accountable. And if we just have an open pay when paid, then you want to like put in one of those, you want to lien a project, they're going to also fight back with their contract stuff that says, well, you're going to have to remove the lien because it's been unfairly put on. That's against the contract. And that's a lot harder to argue because state law does not get superseded by a contract, right? I can't sign a contract that says I'm going to pay my guys $1 an hour, and then state law says I can't do that. So the same is true when it comes to them paying you. So if they only have 60 days or 90 days to file a lien, you have to do that. And if you haven't been paid by that time, it's only fair that you follow law, right?